Hello and welcome to Network Collective. Today we're going to be talking about network automation, something that's discussed a lot in the networking industry right now. But network engineers have been using network automation for years, even decades. So today we're going to look at some real world practical use cases, and we have some great guests to help us flesh that out. So stay tuned. With us today, we have some serious networking talent that also have some serious network automation experience as well. So first, we have Kirk Byers, who really needs very little introduction, especially for this particular topic. So Kirk, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where folks can find you online?
Yeah, so my name is Kirk Byers, and I generally teach Python and Ansible mainly through online courses. I also have a free Python class for network engineers, really into open source quite a bit. So I wrote the NetMiko library. I work quite a bit on the Napalm project as well.
Right, great. I actually have been getting your emails for a long time, so I'm glad you're here with us, Kirk.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ken Celenza, who is a veritable network automation wizard. So Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where folks can find you?
Yeah, I'm in work at Network to Code. It's a small boutique company that specializes in training and network automation services. I've been in the industry for 15 years. And you can find me at on LinkedIn, Ken Celenza, GitHub, It Depends Networks, Twitter, It Depends Net, and probably most actively on Slack on the Network to Code community Slack channel, K Celenza.
Cool. I'm glad you brought up that Slack channel too. That's a good resource. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Ryan Booth, who I actually chat with from time to time about networking careers, network automation stuff. So I'm glad you're here as well. So Ryan, please tell us about yourself and where folks can find you.
Yeah, good to be here myself. My name's Ryan Booth. I've been in networking for 12 plus years right now. Primary focus has always been data center networking. Within my career, I've pretty much seen every part of the industry or every industry, service provider, financial, medical, government, even down small business. Mm-hmm. After I attained my CCIE back in 2015, I started just hardcore focus in on automation, current trends, and, improving my skill set and working with Python development tools, things like that. You can find me on Twitter, that1guy_15. Occasionally I'll blog at blog.movingonesandzeros.net, and anywhere else I'm online, you can usually find me as that1guy15.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. And I'm Phil Gervasi, joined by my co-hosts today, Jordan Martin and Yvonne Sharp. So let me start us off by asking kind of an open-ended question. So what is network automation briefly, and why should a network engineer care about using it in their network?
Yeah, so I'll sort of start with the second part of that, and that's the why should we care? Mm-hmm. And I basically think, if you look across not just networking, but a lot of industries, technology, technical and non-technical, you're just seeing this increasing movement towards more and more automation. And there's lots of things that we do in the networking world where they're very, very lendable to being automated, that computers can do them very well, and really I think should be doing them. And I think we probably should be farther along than we are, given that we're such a technology focused field. But we are where we are, and I think it can reduce how much you do, save you time, mm-hmm. reduce your variance on things, get mm-hmm. more repeatable results. All the standard things why you want to automate things. And, this doesn't say that the human intelligence isn't still required. It's just placed in a different location.
Right. Yeah, you talked about, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the only thing I have to add to that is one of the reasons I say is just, I don't think any of us want to type switch port access VLAN X anymore. It's not fun. It doesn't add any value. And it kind of it frees up your time to do other things.
Okay, so then kind of as a brief general overview definition, what would you guys say that network automation actually is?
Yeah, to me, automation is just taking some part of a process and converting that into a manifestation in software in some way. And there's a whole bunch of different variations of how that can be represented, mm-hmm. so that basically it no longer needs to be required to have human intervention, at least for some part of that chain.
Right.
Now, you could still have parts that need human intervention, but you've taken something that previously was, hey, I'm doing this by hand, and now it's happened automatically.
Yeah, right. And of course, there's some human intervention because somebody's writing the script to begin with, right? But it sounds like the kind of the major points you've touched on thus far were increasing efficiency, decreasing the human error, the human error in the sense of, and there was repeatable tasks that can just kind of be abstracted away, right?
Yeah, and I think there's other advantages you get too, that once you have sort of, systemized your process, it's all there. So I know all of us as network engineers across a long time have witnessed this phenomenon where you learn something from an event, like you're doing an upgrade and X happens. Oh, I'm running this version and there's this problem that I need to manually deal with by doing X, Y, and Z. And the nice thing about having this systematized is then you can bake that learning inherently into your process. So it's not just in, oh, Joe knows X and Jane knows Y and this other person knows Z. It's inherently into the process, and you have a feedback loop on that process. And, there's things humans have to do, like, oh, you have to update your process when you learn new things, but it greatly reduces this compartmentalization of people's knowledge and this losing of people's knowledge across time. So I think there's other, pretty big benefits you get by doing automation.
Yeah. And I know I said I didn't want to talk about industry trends really, but I do want to touch on one thing. So having been a network engineer for 10 years, I know that folks use whatever programming languages they prefer to do this kind of work. They've been doing it for years. So why do you think it's becoming so much more popular to discuss and then actually do among network engineers today in the past few years?
I definitely say there's a couple of big trends there. I think, one of them is that we've witnessed what the server world can do. And we're sort of banging our head, hand against our head and saying, why the heck can't we do that? Yeah. And I think it's starting to make a pretty stark contrast. And then related to that, there was, 10 years ago or so, there was the whole movement towards SDN. And I know the acronym can be bashed, but I think just that movement caused people to be a lot more interested in software applied to network engineering and the things we can do with software applied to network engineering. And I think those are a couple of the big trends that really have started pushing automation more and more to the forefront.
Are you talking about the abstraction of software plane from like data and management plane as far as servers? I know one of the things that we're going to end up talking about is how, like, in the server land you can use Chef or whatever, whatever on-box automation technique to do that.
I was speaking a lot more generally. So, I'm not really speaking about the historic, OpenFlow, which is not that important or interesting to me, programming the data plane. But I think the idea of applying software to network engineering is a very important idea. Okay. And there's a lot of ways that can be done and accomplished. So, so while I might disagree with the original roots of SDN and, I think it does have value in certain situations, but I think the more important thing is they actually got a lot of people interested in applying software to network engineering in one way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I have related to that is what I see is our networks are getting bigger. And we have more and more devices connecting to our networks, right? I mean, most people don't just have a single device. They may have 3. And to me, it seems like the workload is just getting to the point where the same people can't support the same organization the way we used to. At least that's what I see in my world. I'm curious as to whether you automation guys have seen or experienced any of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's something to be said about the person to device ratio, right? Whether it be network equipment or edge devices. I think at some point there's a tipping point where you simply can't manage it by hand. So you have no other choice but to go through. I just want to hit back on one of the reasons I think it is picking up is I think it's a bit of a snowball effect, right? So if I look back 10 years ago, how I would have done similar things is I would create a Perl script for myself, and I would maintain that myself. And, the open source community didn't revolve around like GitHub. It revolved around SourceForge, which really didn't have as many contributors back and forth or kind of, that interaction. It was more of just, hey, this is broke, can you fix it for me? Now there's, people putting PR requests and et cetera. And then as libraries get built and as things get built, it becomes easier for the masses. And then as that kind of becomes easier for the masses, then they'll one of the things I suggest to most people is to start with tooling, whether it be, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, Salt, whatever the case may be, and then move on to programming. So as the tooling gets better, you can innately get more people into it. And I could just be a tooling expert and never have to really, per se, worry about Python or whatever programming language. And then I could kind of aerially, and then everything just becomes a snowball effect. You have more people using it, so more contributors, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, it's interesting, right? Because I think that also part of the genesis of automation has been we haven't really had fantastic tooling in the networking side, and that's why I think it hasn't been as. Now we should have been demanding it, right? Like, it's really I think one of the things that's different is we're now demanding it. We're now demanding APIs, and I know Kirk has been. Oh, it's Kirk's tool, right? For go in and log in and screen scrape and pull things out, and as good as that tool is, it's still ugly, right? Like going in, sending a command that's meant to be a human interaction, and then trying to interpret that. We're not getting back structured data. We're not doing anything. And so it's really hard to automate something that was never intended to be automated. And so, I've always kind of been mystified, having worked both in the system space and in the network space. Coming over to the network space and being like, why is there not more automation? And then you look at it, it's like, well, how in the world would I automate this thing? And you kind of have to be really, really capable programmer to automate anything for the previous generation of equipment. Now we're starting to see that change. And I think that's why the industry is changing too, is now we're starting to get access to things that allow us to automate a lot better.
Kind of circular there, right? So why is it starting to snowball? Because the vendors are starting to allow, open their network operating systems, Linux on box and things like that. And why are they doing that? Because people want to automate. And why do people want to automate? Because vendors are opening up their systems. So kind of circular there. But you're right. I it's pretty cool to get on a Nexus 7K or whatever and drop into a Python prompt. And I don't do anything with it, but it's still cool to do that. So.
Yeah, I think you also get some of the pressure from, the other teams. So, in the past or any organization, it's kind of just known, it's expected that, we need to deploy this new pod, we need to deploy this new application, whatever. Server guys for a while and the application guys have been able to automate that deployment, stand up their servers and everything quickly. But us network guys, like, okay, yeah, I'll have those VLANs provisioned in a couple months. And we're getting that pressure now of, no, that's not acceptable. We need to move faster. We need to be more agile with how we go.
I think that's a great point. I think, when I was in past lives, just being in the enterprise world, let's say the last 3 to 5 years, your biggest competitors were not offshoring or contracting out. It was really everyone coming to you saying, hey, I could click on a button in AWS and I have a server. I could go to Gmail and I have 10 gigs of space. Why can't you provide this? So you essentially had to kind of meet with those demands as well, because to allocate an IP address to take weeks is just no longer acceptable.
Mm-hmm. And network automation helps us to get there, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So one thing that Ken mentioned earlier that I'd like to talk about, because I think there's some interesting ideas around it, is this, is where should people start on this? And I still think you should start with a general purpose language. So I teach both Ansible and Python. And I sell courses in both, so I don't have that much of a vested interest one way or another. And I think I actually have a different opinion here for the server world than the networking world. To me, with Ansible, there's still too many glue components that you need to do. And I still think Ansible is fundamentally programming. I think, people can marketing spin it how they want it to not be programming, but when you get down to it, it is still programming. And there's just too many glue components and too many special operations that you need to accomplish. And without some amount of general purpose programming knowledge, and that bar probably isn't all that high, I think you're sort of in in a race and you're missing a core capability to be able to succeed.
Yeah, I don't fundamentally disagree too much. And Kirk and I have had some kind of side discussions, and I tend to go with this idea. If I have Ansible to handle 90% of what I needed to, and I kind of need to fudge it a bit for that last 10%, it really doesn't fit well in Ansible. Well, I'm going to make it fit so it's just in one platform. You know, there's no hard line, and you know, and I don't even want to stick on Ansible, like just any tooling that you could use.
And even in Ansible, the choice is really yours, because, and we can talk more about Ansible, but there's various ways to solve problems in Ansible. And one of those ways is you can basically break out into Python and say, the heck with this other solution, I'm just going to write some Python code to solve my problem. So, some of these choices are not as clear cut of like saying, oh, are you in Ansible or are you in Python? Because, you can be bridging the two basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like to get started, I tend to say, like I said, tooling, but then exactly as Kirk was saying, very quickly you're going to find that the shortcomings, right? Because they don't meet your, Snowflake type needs. And all the time I'm breaking out to, custom filters or building Ansible modules or, whatever the case may be. And
I
so
think
it's quickly needed,
I think there are certain things from a learning perspective too that can be challenging. Like, for example, to me, when I look at complex Jinja 2 and Jinja 2 is a templating language, it makes me want to bang my head in the wall, because it's really difficult when you get to complex examples of it. And those examples are much, much simpler straight in a general purpose language, whether that's Ruby or Python or Perl. But you can pretty easily get into situations in some of these frameworks where they're not very friendly situations. And yeah, you can get yourself out of them, but it can be pretty ugly getting yourself out of them.
And sometimes I have to take my own past experience to kind of Jinja doesn't bother me, regex doesn't bother me, come from the pro background, so I maybe have a skewed view of things, but let's say to get started with Jinja on a layer 2 campus switch, I think it makes sense for people very quickly out of the box, because it's, I could see my configurations, my standard iOS, EOS configurations, and I could see where the variables are and I could see where the for loops are. So it's very, to me at least, very visually representative. Now, again, to Kirk's point, once you kind of get any more complexity in there, and if it's not let's say one-to-one mapping, then it does become, Jinja can quickly become out of hand and not the best tool per se.
So what languages or tooling would you guys recommend then for somebody who doesn't have 15 years experience? So starting on the ground floor, CCNA, CCNP, and a few years networking experience, and wants to start automating.
Yeah, I would say.
Go ahead, Ken.
Oh, sorry. To me, it's where the industry is. I tend to have a lot of conversations of where we're going, where we are, and I tend to be a person of where we are. And 5-6 years ago, you had CPM modules, right? And that was great. But now you have NetMiko, you have Napalm, you have Ansible. So to me, the clear winner right now is Python. That's not to say that Go or Rust is going to be right around the corner. But the network drivers to me are one of the biggest pieces, because you don't want to be in Kirk is in that business of building these network drivers, but on the mass, it's not a business you're going to scale very well yourself.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think an important part on top of that I was having this conversation actually this morning over breakfast is, the trends could shift. Everything could go to, a different language, just like Ken said. But I think one of the most important aspects of that is, as you're picking up your first language, is learning the basics, learning the fundamentals. Because even though you're shifting from language to language, those fundamentals are most likely going to stay the same, and they can transition easily. So as a network engineer myself, coming in completely fresh, that was one of my key focuses, was understanding those fundamentals, understanding those basics.
Well, I think it's the thinking programmatically. Right. So, a completely non-automated network environment, I don't have to think about it programmatically. I just kind of look at it and say, okay, this thing is broken, I need to fix it, or I need this new feature. What do I need to do? When you start thinking about things, with the idea of automation and programming in mind, whether it's through tooling or programming, you have to think about it more in the lines of there has to be some logical structure. I have to have, some things have to be in place before I can really start doing anything with it. And I have to think like a programmer. I have to think like, you don't have to be the best programmer. That's one of my pet peeves in this, every network engineer's got to become a programmer. It's a whole other episode. We probably shouldn't dive into that one. But
it's going to be a good one too.
I'm sure it will. But the idea, like Ryan was saying, is when you start looking and learning a programming language, there's some really fundamental things like string manipulation and loops and variables and how to work with those things. Those things are universal. It doesn't matter whether you're using them in Perl, Python, Ruby, whatever. It doesn't matter what language you're using them in, and they translate quite well into some of the tooling as well. So those concepts, it doesn't really matter which language you learn the concepts. I was not a Python guy. I had learned using other languages. I took Kirk's class and it got me up to speed on Python, mainly just because I could, here's where it's different and it handles this differently. And it's more of a looking at the differences between the two rather than having to learn a whole new language. And so it's.
But even so, even if it was learning a whole new language, so for somebody who's got like I said, a few years experience and a CCNA and they're a network admin and no programming experience, Python's not hard to pick up. Python's just not that hard to pick up.
It really isn't. And I think that's what I was leading to was the fact that not that,
We're on the same page.
Yeah. One particular language is better than another or easier, but the idea is the language isn't the important part.
Yeah.
Right. The language it's learning how to think about that way and then find the one that suits your needs.
Okay.
Yeah. And one other thing that I think is worth talking about here is that, while I think from a learning perspective, you need to spend a certain amount of time with a general purpose language. Mm-hmm. I think from an automation perspective, you really should be looking for a framework to do things. And, you could talk about whether you should use, Ansible or Salt or something else. But I think you probably want to try to avoid, the create my own system syndrome. Mm-hmm. And I think you really want to try to leverage the things that a framework like Ansible or Salt or something else will give you, Chef, Puppet, what have you. And I think in the networking world, Ansible and Salt are clearly ahead of the others. So you probably should be choosing from one of those two, unless you have a really good reason not to. But those things provide really valuable benefits. So you should be strongly thinking about trying to use one of those. Okay.
So now I'd like to move on to, I'm looking at the show notes here and I see that, I don't know who put it in there, but there's 3 areas of automation, which I think is a really good thing to touch upon here. Automated deployment, configuration management, add, move changes, that sort of thing, validation, and then troubleshooting and visibility. So why don't we take a moment and talk about those? What do you guys think about those 3 areas?
Yeah, I would say part of it, one of the things, I put in some of the notes was just the journey that I tend to see is about getting information at first, right? So I just need to know what the state is, whether it's configuration state, operational state. I kind of need to know that. And it generally lets people kind of get their feet wet without having to actually touch anything, right?
Then so you're not pushing config is what you're saying?
Not pushing config, yeah.
You're just getting that information from the box.
Absolutely. And in a structured format, so I could query it later. I could put it into, a JSON file, a database, whatever the case may be. Let's say, I had a certain engagement where the customer was looking for, hey, we have these specific troubleshooting steps that we take. We run these commands, and it takes a while to run these commands. So you know what? We kind of wrote something to go out and just run the commands, present them for you, right? So that seems to be like kind of, one of the basic things. And again, like I said, it helps people get their feet wet. Then becomes kind of pushing configurations additively, right? Let's call it. So I'm just going to say that VLAN 10 should be there, but not that VLAN 1 through 9 and 10 through 4,000 should not be there, right? And then kind of moving on to the next step of being fully declarative, right? And it's certainly a large part of a journey. None of it is going to be, if you get to that part within 12 to 18 months, that'd be very impressive, right? So, but yeah, I think you should be looking down these different areas and saying, how would I use these pieces? Where would I use these pieces?
So I'd add, and this is totally consistent with what Ken was saying, but I would look for certain areas where you have high value you're going to get out of it and you have low risk.
Mm-hmm.
So with information gathering, there's only so badly you can screw things up. Whenever you start transitioning into config, the risk of screwing something up goes higher. So when you migrate into the config area, look for the same principle. What's pretty low risk, but that's a pretty big win. And you keep sort of repeating that pattern of trying to, expand farther and farther into what you're doing.
Yeah, I want to. Sorry, just want to add one thing to that. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ken.
Oh, sorry. Just want to add to that. Like one of the things when we get scoped, sometimes it tends to be we're going to solve the world, and we say no. Let's take this back. Let's really break this down to actual sizable chunks, because there's from our perspective there's nothing worse than not being able to deliver. And simply put, when you initially look at automation, you don't even know what you need per se. As you build, as you see YAML files, JSON files, what is being done, you can be more intelligent to say what you need going forward. And we want to deliver the best product and actual sizable chunk products to our customers.
And I was just going to give a few practical examples of what I've seen done with automation in an environment where I've worked, and to give people ideas for things they can do with automation. For example, we had a network automation guy write a script that crawled all of our devices at a site, show you all the MAC addresses. And if you're doing a major migration, to know, we need to put these ports on a different VLAN because we're making a change. And so you can automate that from an information gathering standpoint and still do the work manually. And then you can transition into having your automation tool go in and automatically change those VLANs. Wireless LAN controllers are another great example. There are some, at least with Cisco wireless LAN controllers, there are some oddities with VLAN mappings to SSIDs, especially in FlexConnect. And so you can pull all that information and put it in a CSV file or in some sort of sortable, searchable format so that you can easily see if there are mismatches between VLAN IDs and SSIDs. And you can do that in 30 seconds as opposed to this manual clicky process to go through the user interface. Those are really fairly simple things that can save your networking team a ton of time just by presenting data in a way that makes sense. And those are some pretty straightforward examples.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. That's actually the point where, for myself, that's what I've always recommended, or that's where I start my approach from, or have, is, all of us network engineers and even teams have either wikis, or we all have our own personal text files or Word documents that if we're being asked to do task A, we have a list of commands that we're going to run in there and we're going to run. Or we hand that off to tier 1, tier 2 guys and say, hey, go collect all this stuff or track this down. And that list of commands right there can quickly be automated. Build it into a playbook, build it into something. And it doesn't have to be something that gives you back this massive amount of intelligence. Just structure the data, give it back to me and put it in like a report style, or dump it out as a CVS. And then that allows them to pull that data, or someone to very quickly just run that playbook and then present me the data while I'm still waking up and getting coffee during a P1 in the middle of the night or whenever. And yeah, that's a quick win right there.
Mm-hmm.
And just troubleshooting time savings, right? How can I get data quicker as opposed to iterating through 10 devices manually in the CLI to find a MAC address? I mean, if I could write a script to find a MAC address and tell me which switch and which switch port it's on, and it can run in 30 seconds, where that would take me maybe 30 minutes to crawl through, that's a huge win.
Yeah.
And there's no risk. There's no risk to developing something like that.
Right. And kind of along that line, a little bit different than kind of the general way the conversation has gone, but with that idea of troubleshooting and scripting that, I've seen, some scripting done with EEM, right, on Cisco devices where a problem happens that may be transient. All of a sudden you get a CPU spike. Mm-hmm. And it may happen at 2:00 in the morning, or it may happen about 4:00 in the afternoon. You don't know when it's going to happen. You have no idea what's causing it. But being able to trigger that off and then script your troubleshooting, show me, my CPU history, and show me my memory utilization, and show me all those things to kick off on that CPU so that you can do that. And so this idea of finding those places where you can quickly win. Yeah. That's not, it's not an incredibly intelligent script, right? It doesn't take a massive amount of programming capability to make that happen. But here it is, this thing that would be transient to somebody who didn't know how to automate that process becomes available to you, to get a win.
Yeah, one more add-on to this is kind of where I made my initial bones in scripting was just, the idea of your configurations are largely 99%, the same. You have 10 variables in there, right? So even if you don't get to the point where you're applying the configurations automatically, generating the configurations, via a central, Jinja or whatever templating system, I think is vastly valuable. Like, pretty much every organization I've been at, I've kind of taken that with me, maybe initially in Perl, then to some CPAN module, and then now into Jinja. But I think that's a great way to get started. And
that also has
a ton of value,
that also has the real value of, there's, 20 different ways to do X things, but when it comes down to it, the value of one versus the other is outweighed just by the fact that you have all this variation, that engineer 1 does it this way and engineer 2 does it this way and engineer 3 does it this way. Mm-hmm. And, us network engineers, we can haggle for hours over which one's marginally better, but it's a bigger problem that we have that variation. And just, doing what Ken is saying there with the templating and standardizing your configs and what's generated, can help you across time to start reduce your variation, which in the long run will also help you do more automation.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, as I kind of build configurations or done auditing against configurations, there was always a fingerprint per engineer, so I could always tell who did it based on the way they name the descriptions or where they weighted stuff. And it's funny. There's you have those standard docs, but nobody fully commits to them. They all have their own. And everyone goes, I just take this doc, then I remove this line, I remove this line. And you go, wait, well, why don't you push that back up the doc? Well, whatever,
Yeah,
so
but to be fair, Ken, a few shows ago, Jordan brought up the idea that we're network artists. So there is an element of artistry and flair that we want to add to every config. Right?
That was not the context.
No, it wasn't, but I reserve the right to pull it right out of context and use it as I feel.
Is that network artists or network masochists?
Or network artistes?
There we go.
Are those mutually exclusive?
Yeah.
No, not really.
So an example, sorry, go ahead, Jordan. Please.
We've been talking very operationally and it's good. So we're talking focusing thinking about the enterprise engineer, the guy who's sitting in a cube who's managing a network.
Yeah.
But this idea of templating and scripting and automating configs, I'm from a reseller, right? And so, I recently did a project at a hospital, replaced, there's 150 switches, right? And I wasn't changing the way the switches operated. We were upgrading them. And we were going from individual switches to stack switches. So there was a one-to-one replacement, but it wasn't quite the same. And it wasn't configured the same across the board. And so I was able to use, I used Python. I pulled down all their configs, generated new configs based off of what they had. Instead of having every VLAN in the entire network on every single switch, only deployed the VLANs that were needed for the switch, kind of did some cleanup. But then every switch had that same templated feel, but I was able to reuse the information that was already in the network by pulling and using that and filling in those variables. And then when we went to go stage all those switches, man, it was all of them all at once. Apply text files, it wasn't automated deployment. It's very manual deployment, but using automation, we were able to make sure, and there wasn't a port that was missed because it wasn't me copying 100%
and pasting. 100% success, huh? That's pretty good.
It wasn't me copying and pasting it. If it was me copying and pasting, it would have been 20% success?
Well, you joke, but copying and pasting, copying and pasting is the traditional network automation, method, isn't it? Notepad is our most favorite text editor, and copy paste, copy pasta, right?
Secure CRT in the chat window.
There you go. Which actually I still do.
I like the chat window.
I still do that. But to throw out one quick example that I use all the time because it sticks in my brain. It was the first time I ever was having to think about these things as far as automating tasks. Was a really big ICE project, and I use this example every time I talk about network automation with folks, with my students and at work. And we had literally thousands upon thousands of access switches, and I don't know, tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of ports that needed .1x configuration, that sort of thing. But even before that, we needed to just pull information because, as you guys know, the certain hardware and software requirements for running ICE. We needed to know what we had out there because we didn't have good documentation. So for a while, I was doing show CDB neighbors, switch by switch by switch, just to track stuff, and then doing a quick show ver and copying stuff. And it was painful. I don't want to tell you how much I made, but it wasn't entry level salary, right? And I was doing that for like 2 weeks. My company wasted, I don't want to say it was a waste because I did work, right? And we got the project moving along. But man, I mean, think about how many hours I put into that. I didn't know much better. So, I claim ignorance there, but that's an example of I think a really practical use case that folks, people are putting ICE in today, right? And doing inventories of 500 switches or even less, right? So I don't know if you have an example like that that you can think of, but certainly that was something that was meaningful, right? Both to the bottom line, dollars and cents, time, the monotony, because I hated myself for those 2 weeks. I didn't hate myself. I hated my job. Let me change that a little bit. I hated myself a little bit, but man, it was miserable. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm actually just finishing up or maybe finish up a phase of engagement where exactly the same thing. It's 802.1x configurations. And they just wanted the auditing. So they have the compliance check to sit there and say, we have 60,000 ports. How many of them have the configuration on there? And, these are 4507s all fold out, so literally 10,000 lines of configuration code, right? So if one port out of there is missing one line, which that has actually happened, like however, when it was copy pasted in, it was missing one line. Yeah. It's technically out of compliance. So it's impossible for them to go through it. It's not even reasonable that they would ever go through it. Yeah. And you actually have the reporting of it to sit there and say, what percentage, how many ports do we have? What percentage of ports are compliant? Which ones are not? Which ones are system ports or uplink ports, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially with that really, sort of repetitive, at a certain point becomes brain dead kind of work. It wasn't brain dead when it was originally created. There could have been a lot of thought there, but when you're copying it over and over and thousands of times, it's also just really easy to screw it up. Even for very, very diligent people, you just get so bored with that operation that it's really easy to miss something.
And you ultimately add no value to the company by spending all that time, copying, pasting, over and over and over. Yeah. Yeah.
I was a spreadsheet guru for those couple of weeks. And the solution to make it quicker and better was to add more people, not to figure out a better way. Well, that's what happened. We started to pull people from, around the country, global companies. So we started to pull people in. What a waste. So I do have a question for you. We've talked about Python and we've talked about Ansible quite a bit, but there were a couple comments about how Ansible is a preferred tooling method. Why is that?
I'll take this.
Go ahead, Ken.
No, I would start with I just think from what I've seen, it's been the lowest barrier to entry, and I do agree with Kirk. It is a programming language. Like it has all these aspects of it. But just to sit there and get something functional back the quickest, it's there. And again, it's a snowball effect. As people have been developing Ansible drivers, now if you worked on iOS, you have the Ansible supported version, you have NTC Ansible, Napalm, you have all these different kind of methods. And, for me, for instance, I can't ever get stuck because Napalm doesn't support something. I have to move on. My clients demand I deliver, so I have to deliver. So I always just find a way of getting to work. So to me, the biggest thing has been just that is the barrier to entry.
Okay. So I'd augment what Ken was saying there a little bit in that, I think a framework like Ansible, and I'd add a little asterisk that Salt really interests me as well, and I really want to start doing more due diligence and dive into Salt. But I think a framework like Ansible gives you certain things in a systematic way. And Ken mentioned some of them, like it has this whole modularity. So it makes it really easy for you to reuse code that Ken wrote, that I wrote, that other people wrote inside, pretty lightweight scripting. It also has a whole inventory system and a whole variable system. And I think the problem people get into is if they go down the road of build it themselves, is it becomes too much dependent likely on a single person. and the knowledge of that single person. And he gets too much into, he reinvents everything here. He's the only one that has any knowledge. He's the only one that's capable of doing automation. And then I think you go down this road where your automation at a certain point for a given organization just ends, because the person that knew it's gone, nobody understands how it works. Nobody understands how it fits together. Nobody can really pick it up and keep moving it forward.
Yeah, and I'd be critical of myself a bit in years past of I tended to find fix problems, but not come up with solutions, if that makes sense. So it was always, okay, what do I need to do and how do I do that? There was never a framework so that I could leverage this later on. And that was probably a shortcoming, in my career. Maybe not having mentorship or wherever else the case may be, not understanding that.
I think that's a normal progression, though. I mean, I appreciate that you're saying that, but I think that's like, scripting or programming, right? You start off with the big long, this does 20 things all in one script. None of it's reusable. And then the guys who
it's all in main,
Yes.
And then you look at the guy who's been doing it for 20 years and like everything is just like completely reusable block of code and nothing.
And it's
like
beautiful.
The main function is like 3 lines long, right? And like that's it. Yeah.
But the unfortunate part with that is you can't read it at first. It takes a while. It takes some experience to kind of understand where things are and why they're there.
All right. I have another question. What we talked about some of the things that somebody that is sort of just starting out with network automation, what they can do to get rocking and rolling from the ground level. What can they hope to do later on? So we haven't really touched upon some of those advanced things. We talked about gathering that information. Maybe it's ephemeral information that's short-lived or just software versions or VLAN information. We talked about some very minor configuration pushes. I think somebody talked about pushing like interface descriptions, something that's non-invasive, whatever. What are some more advanced things that folks could hope to do later on that, again, is meaningful and can add value to what they're doing as a network engineer?
Yeah, I would say...
Go ahead, Ken.
Oh, sorry, I keep interrupting you, Kirk. I would say building a workflow kind of, let's say a +1. So you check in, via Jira, Git, whatever else the case may be. And you pretty much get yourself away from the CLI other than the design architecture aspect of it, right? So design, you build, maybe deploy it manually, to a few places at first or a few pods at first, and then, automate it. But the nirvana is essentially everything is done in code, right? So whether variables or whatever, and everything just gets automatically pushed, right? So you have a script that sits there and it says like, this is a safe change, so thus I could just go ahead and push it right now. We've done this a million times; it's never done an issue. But then you may have something say, okay, this is this requires some kind of interaction, but with the network engineer, but there's still no going onto the CLI, right? You push playbooks or you run scripts against your infrastructure instead. So and again, being fully declarative, saying I trust my variables or whatever my source of truth no longer becomes the network configuration. It becomes what I maintain, right? And the proof really becomes in the pudding where if a user or a network engineer goes and configures a port for a server admin, right? And server admin's happy. And then that night we declaratively push our intent of the configuration and that gets removed from them. Well, they're not going to do that again. That's the last time they do that because they're going to have to go and fix it. So that's really, to me, that fully declarative, completely automated and peer review type system is like the holy grail of Nirvana.
That sounds pretty sweet.
So I'd add a couple of things there in that. So, I think there's some interesting things you can start to do with integration of your workflows and your system. So like, for example, you're adding new networking devices and there's all the things that Ken talked about there with like, okay, well, like how do we get configs managed and pushed to those devices? But whenever you're adding new devices, there's a whole bunch of auxiliary system those devices need to go into. And there's no reason those things like, bandwidth monitoring, management monitoring, up-down monitoring, syslog stuff, inventory systems. There's a whole bunch of auxiliary systems these devices need to go into. And there's no reason that integration and that process as well can't be happened automatically. So You have some process that adds devices to your network. And as part of that process, well, okay, they're getting added to the inventory system. They're getting added to the up-down system. And this all happens just as part of those workflows.
So those all sound like great opportunities for somebody who's in a much larger environment that they can take advantage of those things. Do you think that there's a benefit for this type of network automation for somebody who's working in a place with maybe, a handful of sites and 500, 600 switches that doesn't have that same type of move, add, change, churn going on?
I mean, definitely if you're talking 500, 600, I mean, if you start to get really, really small, then I think there starts to be the trade-off of, is it worth it? But really, really small would be, to me, much smaller than 500, 600. If you start getting down under 30, 20, something like that, then you could definitely see the situation where saying like, okay, in the long run, are you really saving yourself any time? Now, I think one thing that happens in the really small bucket is those are getting rolled up by, IT management organizations, and the IT management organizations are now managing, in number of those really small customers. So I think a lot of those still get pushed into this bucket, but just in a slightly, different form.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think also with the smaller customer where it can come into play is because usually if you're the IT guy or the network guy for someone that's small, you wear multiple hats. So you're also the server guy, you're also the storage guy, you manage the APs. And so that could be an opportunity where you build this stuff out basic, but then you start integrating those workflows together. And you can actually use that opportunity to build that type of stuff together. So you're not just necessarily building out and provisioning servers, you're doing the VLANs and the trunks and things like that as well as you're going up.
Yeah. And starting small, right? There's no reason that you have to, write some script that touches every single device in your network, right? I mean, you could start with a rack or a closet. If you're in a place that has just a few hundred switches, who's to say that you can't start in just an MDF and do it that way, right?
Well, and that's also the key. We kind of hit on that a little earlier. Jordan did, is we don't have to do the whole process all at once. We don't have to build start to finish. Let's pick a piece of it. Let's grab the low hanging fruit. Yeah. Let's automate the build of the config, and then we'll manually push it. And then the next iteration, we can, do a ZTP type process. Yeah.
And I would add to that, not only that you don't have to, but you shouldn't be trying to. That I think you're setting yourself up for failure if you view it as being, I have to do everything. You need to find like some small part of your process and automate that, and then find a second small part of your process.
I just feel like Kirk is just stealing my thoughts as I'm thinking them. So just saying them before me.
So guys,
I try to do that.
where do you guys recommend that folks can go online to get some information, some material, just to get started, to ground level kind of stuff, and then build up from there? Where can folks go?
Perhaps I'm biased, but I think the Network to Code Slack channel is a ton of great people. A ton of open source maintainers, and just some industry titans there too.
Yeah, it's an open channel, right?
And myself,
and yourself.
I'll second Network to Code. That Slack group is amazing, and the conversation that goes on there and the people that are involved, it's become phenomenal. It's an awesome resource.
One of my greatest events that happened there was somebody, probably a newer engineer came on and said, "What is a subnet?" And it was, maybe a little bit of an eye roll. A moment for myself, but then all of a sudden you end up getting some, like, I think Russ White and like a few other people, like some titans really kind of in there and really started getting in down such a, innate, question. It was pretty interesting and pretty kind of surreal in a sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a really great community. And I've been really impressed in general with just how open and, friendly, good interactions people have in there. Like, some environments are more open and better to interact with. And it's been really sort of amazing across time in that.
Yeah. I also subscribe to Kirk's emails and some other folks out there. So there's a ton of resources online. Everybody, all these guys here have GitHub pages that you can check out as well. We've just scratched the surface. Glancing at our show notes, we got through a small part of it. And then also just knowing these guys and what they do, we really are just scratching the surface. So we encourage you to dig into those resources that are out there. Many of them are just free and open for anybody, and the people are awesome. So there's always help available. Kirk, Ryan, Ken, this has been a really great show. We really appreciate you guys being here, your expertise, your passion for what you do. And to our audience, thanks for checking out this episode today. Please make sure to follow us on Twitter at Net Collective PC. What is it, Jordan?
Net Collective PC. You got it.
Okay. Thank you. I forgot that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, tweet at us, email us, let us know what you think. We love those comments and that feedback. Our LinkedIn page, our Facebook page. We love hearing from you. So again, thanks to our guests and for checking us out today. Before we go, I'd like to give my co-hosts an opportunity to let everyone know where we can find them. So Yvonne, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, you can find me on the blog at esharp.net or on Twitter at Sharp Network.
Great. And Jordan?
So I'm at BC Jordo on Twitter, and my blog is jordanmartin.net.
Great. I'm Phil Gervasi. You can find me on Twitter at network_Phil. My blog is networkphil.com. So check us out in a few weeks when we have a really cool show coming up where we're going to talk about the quote unquote sacred cows of networking. Those things that we sort of assume to be true, but maybe aren't. We're gonna take a deep dive into that, and make sure that you're checking out our other shows like the History of Networking, where we have some really awesome guests coming on from time to time to talk about what's been going on in the industry for years past. So again, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.